if you guys haven't read that book, then, you know, you're not living. And the thing about Valiant is, it sounds dramatic, but Valiant, like, changed my life. Like, I read this book, and it was like nothing I had ever read before. And I think part of it was that when I first started reading it when I was about 14, it had like swearing, people were using drugs, and it was really gritty and dark, and it kind of scared me a little bit. Like, I felt a little uncomfortable while I was reading it. But it was also this exploration of these fantasy themes that I had never seen before. And a lot of the themes that it deals with is a lot of fairy folklore. And I really got interested in that kind of lore, and I started getting into it and reading more books about it. And one thing that has always intrigued me the most about any kind of fairy lore in fantasy is the idea of changelings specifically, and just in general, people who are either stumble into the world of fairy or are taken there. And one thing that I always noticed when I was reading books that had dealt with those themes is it's usually about a person who's had a loved one taken, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a friend, something like that, and their journey is sort of trying to get that person back. And what I was always curious about, and what I never really saw touched upon very much, is what about the person who's taken? You know, what is their experience like? What happens after they come back, if they come back at all? Because that's usually where the story ends. And I couldn't really find any books where that was explored, so that's when I started writing my own book, that's what I wanted to look at. So when I was writing Flicker, pretty much all of the human characters are dealing with that sort of experience in one way or another. Being the changeling that was taken away, being the person that ended up in fairy and has to sort of deal with that now that they're back. So the first scene that I would like to read for you today is just sort of a character interaction that deals with some of that getting towards the end of Flicker. Rain was pattering against the windows when Lee shoved the covers back, throwing her legs over the side of the bed. It had to be well past midnight, but she was still awake, her eyes aching with weariness. She looked across the dim room to the sleeping figures that occupied the other beds, envying them. Though Nasser and Jason had dropped almost immediately into deep sleep, Lee had slept restlessly, in short bursts broken by dreams of choking and blindness and blood. She longed for sleep, but her mind worked relentlessly. Hoping a glass of water might help, she padded quietly to the workroom. Philo was slumped in a chair before the fireplace, the collected Shakespeare cradled between his hands. The pile of blankets he'd been sleeping on these past few nights had been shoved aside. Without looking up at her, he grumbled, "What do you want?" "Nothing," she said, setting aside her previous intentions. She pulled up a chair and dropped into it. "I just can't sleep." Figures. With a small sigh, Philo reached for a small glass bottle on a nearby table and passed it to her. It was half filled with lavender liquid. "Here, drink this. 2 swallows ought to do it for you." Lee eyed him uncertainly, then brought the bottle to her lips and swallowed twice. She expected something sweet and soothing, but the potion was bitter. She coughed as she gave the bottle back to Philo, wiping her mouth with her sleeve. "I don't feel any different." "Give it a few minutes. It'll knock you out." Her gaze wandered back to the collected Shakespeare. "I read some of those plays, you know, in school. Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream. We were supposed to read Hamlet junior year, but..." She bit her lip. Her voice was small. "Well, I never made it back to school for junior year." He snorted. "To die, to sleep perchance to dream." He gave her a sideways look. "Hamlet is a good play. You should read it. Maybe you'll lend me your copy." She gently took the book from him, almost surprised when he let her. Leafing through its thin pages, she noticed it was one of the few books not stamped with Nem and Morgan's insignia. "How long have you had this?" "A long time. I found it in a box downstairs when I was a kid, and I used to read it all the time." He shrugged. "It was good practice." "For what?" "English. We didn't speak it much with Nem and Morgan. When Nasser and Jason came, I understood everything they said, but I had a hard time forming the words, and my accent was so thick that they couldn't understand much of what I did say," he added. "So I would take that book and read it aloud. I didn't know words could be so beautiful." They sat in silence for a while, Lee waiting patiently for drowsiness to come over her and Philo gazing into the depths of the fire. Eventually she spoke, her voice quiet. "I know how Nasser and Jason got here. The whole story. Nasser told me. He didn't say anything about you, but I think I know." He scoffed. "What do you know?" "They took you," Lee said softly. That's what you meant when you said you don't have parents, that Nemen and Morgan found out about you when you were very little and took you. And as far as your real parents know, their son is dead. He is dead, but you're not him. His voice was firm yet hushed, as if he were sharing some vital secret. That boy died the moment Nemen Morgan touched him. His family buried who he was along with a piece of wood. Then he was given a new name, one that could never be used against him because it wasn't real. And he became me, a changeling. That's what I am. Not the one left behind, but the one taken away. For a long time, Lee just stared at him. He was very still, and he seemed very far away. "Who are you, then?" she asked. "Really?" When his gaze flickered toward her, the blue in his eyes seemed softened, bruised, as if she had hurt him. "I'm Philo Shine," which is fine, except Philo Shine doesn't exist. "Just because you're dead on paper doesn't mean you don't exist," she said. "I should know." "That's not it. Names are magical, Lee. They're powerful, dangerous." He looked her in the eyes. "There is magic that can force any being to do your bidding. Any being, so long as you can speak its true and full name. Did you know that?" Lee shook her head mutely. "Names define us," he continued. "They give us shape and form and identity. Your true name is the most precious thing you own." "But your true name is gone," she realized, "and the name they gave you is entirely worthless," he finished bitterly. "My name is Philo Shine. But there is no Philo Shine. It's just a name Nem and Morgan picked because they had to call me something. It doesn't mean anything to anyone. But it's the only name I have, so I'm only what it makes me." Her eyes were beginning to feel heavy, but Lee fought the urge to yawn. "Do you ever wonder about them?" she ventured. "Your family?" He shook his head wearily. "I spent most of my childhood teaching myself not to wonder. There's no point. All wondering does is make you feel sick." "Oh, I'm sorry." She stood, then she offered the book to him. "I should try to get some sleep now. Thanks for the potion." He only shrugged and accepted the book without looking at her. He clutched it tightly like an amulet, like something that could keep him safe. She noticed the dark circles that ringed his eyes, the fresh bruises on his face, and she wondered how it could be that someone so young could hold himself with all the sadness of 100 years of living. She crossed to the bedroom, but lingered in the doorway, one hand on the frame. "Hey, Philo?" Though she didn't look back at him, she felt his eyes on her back. "For what it's worth, you seem pretty real to me."